we have a capacitive weighing principle. And the way we do it is we measure a change in distance. So we have a contactless measuring principle. So that means we weigh as accurate as everyone else. But when it comes to weighing systems that get either shock, side loads, overload, or any kind of disturbance, because ours is contactless, ours is much more robust, which feeds into a much higher reliability of the load cell. We can see that a lot of the customers we approach, they're not aware of that. So it's basically like we are different. What is inside the load cell is completely different in our load cell compared to 95% of the providers out there. So again, everyone is using this traditional strain gauge technology. A lot of people have, of course, worked on optimizing, refining that technology. But as any technology, it comes with advantages and disadvantages.
Welcome to the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast, where we decode the complexities of bioprocess development together. I'm David Bruhlmann, and today we are diving deep into a critical yet often overlooked component of bioprocessing, the load cell technology. Joining us is Anders Tvegaard, who is the COO at Eilersen, who is here to share fascinating insights about how these precision instruments are revolutionizing single-use systems and bioprocess monitoring. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Eilersen, the weighing expert, for supporting this episode. Now let's explore the evolution of load cell technology and its impact on modern bioprocessing. Are you juggling the complexities of CMC development while trying to enjoy the beauty of biotech? Have you ever wondered if there's a way to simplify bioprocessing? Welcome to the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast, where we're diving headfirst into the very challenges you face. We're breaking it down, demystifying the jargon, and giving you the keys to unlock your full potential. I'm your host, David Bruhlmann, and I get it. With 15 plus years in the biotech industry, I face the same challenges you do. There's a way to simplify and streamline so you can remove complexity, you can skip trials and errors, deliver without delay your groundbreaking therapy to clinics and market, and still enjoy every single step. Do you want to learn how industry experts and I did it? Grab a cup of coffee and your favorite notebook and pen. Now is the time to take your bioprocessing game to the next level. Let's smarten up biotech. Welcome, Anders. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, David. It's a pleasure.
It's a huge pleasure to have you on. And since you are bringing in a bit of different perspective to our podcast, I'm really excited. So I'm curious, share something that you believe about bioprocess development that most people disagree with.
Well, like within our field, I think that what we claim is that weighing on mobile single-use vessels is not difficult. So actually having a reliable, robust weighing on any kind of a mobile towed mixer back can be done easily with the right technology.
That's fantastic. I'm excited to dive a bit deeper into the world of weighing. Weighing is the daily bread of us biotech scientists. We weigh all kinds of things. It starts in a lab and then goes into the large-scale facility, a lot of different applications. But first of all, I would like to hear your story. Can you please paint us a picture of your professional journey that brought you to doing the work that you're doing today? And what were some interesting pit stops along the way?
Yeah, I've been working with industrial technologies for many years in both small and large companies. All of it has been centered around the commercialization of technology. So this thing about actually doing commercial development of industrial companies. There's so many interesting industrial technology companies out there. And I think the key learning I have after having a professional career for almost 25 years, you can basically have the best technology in the world, but if no one knows it, it doesn't really matter. It's not only about having the best technology. Of course, that is always a good thing to have, but it's also about actually creating the awareness, making sure that you position it correctly in the market, making sure you're able to explain it to your potential customers, and you support your customers getting the value out of the technology as you desire. So I think it's also about there is a commercial part to this, which is not just product centric, which is not just about having a great technology, but it's also about actually being able to convey it to the market, being able to tell them what they should choose. So guide the market on how to get the most value out of your technology. So that's the key learning. And this is also what we're doing here at Eilersen. That's what we are trying to be better at every day, because we have great technology, but sometimes we haven't been so good at telling the world. So we are practicing on that.
And have you always been in the more like sales and marketing side of the industry, or like where did you come from? Can you tell us a bit from where you started?
Yeah, I actually started with computer science from the technical side. So I came actually from, you can say, product development production, and then got moved more and more closer to the customers and found that interesting. So then slowly moved to the commercial side. And this is because that understanding the customer need is really what drives most commercial development and most corporate development, actually, and making sure you actually understand it in a good way. Because a lot of companies, again, think they understand the customers, but it's more interpretations of what the customer needs than what they actually need. I've always find it fascinating and interesting to actually engage with customers so that they get the value out of whatever product or technology you're bringing to the market. So I started out actually on the technical side, was a programmer originally, did different computer software, and then moved more and more closer to the customer, and that automatically brings you to the commercial side. So came into sales and marketing afterwards. As my old co-students at the university say, they say I'm completely de-skilled because I can't code anymore. But then you learn something else.
Fantastic. And now you are selling weighing systems. But as we just talked during the pre-briefing, it's not just for the regular use. So can you tell us, first of all, before we dive into the technology, like who you're targeting actually, or like what applications usually targeting with your weighing systems?
Here at Eilersen, we have, and we'll come back to that, but we have a pretty special weighing technology, which is unique in the world, and we actually have it patented globally. Where any type of technology has benefits and, of course, some disadvantages as well, where our weighing technology is really beneficial and is really valuable is within process weighing, and especially within the pharmaceutical sector, because with both the regulatory requirements, with the need for very, very high accuracy and very, very high reliability, the features of our technology just fits extremely well into the process weighing part of pharmaceutical and biotech industry. So we look at production, we look at large-scale production. That's where our technology comes into play and is making a difference for our customers.
And you're using load cells to do that, right? So can you explain us how they work and how this technology has evolved in the bioprocessing industry?
So basically, you can say there's a lot of providers of load cells out there. 98% of them use the same technology. And again, David, I don't know how aware you are of load cell technology, but most manufacturers of load cells, they use strain gauge technology. So this is the traditional way of weighing things, is that a change in resistance in your load cell, and you measure that change, and then you turn that into a weighing signal, or you can say your weight out of that. What we do is different. We have a capacitive weighing principle. And the way we do it is we measure a change in distance. So we have a contactless measuring principle. So that means we weigh as accurate as everyone else. But when it comes to weighing systems that get either shock, side loads, overload, or any kind of disturbance, because ours is contactless, ours is much more robust, which feeds into a much higher reliability of the load cell. And I think that's something that we can see that a lot of the customers we approach, they're not aware of that. So it's basically like we are different. What is inside the load cell is completely different in our load cell compared to 95% of the providers out there. So again, everyone is using this traditional strain gauge technology. A lot of people have, of course, worked on optimizing, refining that technology. But as any technology, it comes with advantages and disadvantages. The advantage with strain gauge is it's super easy to do. The disadvantage, it's a sensitive technology. Because again, if you overload, because there's a physical contact in the strain gauge technology, if you overload the load cell, you'll break it. Either you bring it out of calibration, or worst case, you actually break the load cell, so it won't work anymore. For ours, because it's contactless, if we get a shock on the load cell, a very, very short overload event, then our load cell will go back to the original state. And there will not be any physical damage on the load cell. Because again, we measure distance, so we basically measure air. And that means that we can tolerate overload to a much higher extent than a traditional strain gauge load cell. This is basically just the features of the technology. And this is where we see that our technology comes into play, is typically if you have an environment where these things can happen. And if we talk about bioprocessing, this has a lot to do with emerging or that adoption of single-use technology, where mobility becomes a much higher or much more present requirement. So In a lot of the what customers, the bioprocessing customers, they require weighing on mobile units. So that's again the different vessels, mixers, bag holder. And as soon as you have to move something, you have the risk of having a shock or an overload event on your weighing system. And this means on traditional load cells, strain gauge load cells, you would have to either put some protection brackets on them, you would have to lock the weighing system before you move it. Because again, if you move it and you run it over, let's say it's a mobile mixer, you run it over a cable, that cable shock will basically bring load cells out of calibration. You don't need that with our capacitive technology. Because it's contactless, the mobile mixer, you can move it without having to lock the system, protect the system in any way. You just move it to a new location and it will still be in calibration. So this robustness feature is something we see. And again, we have seen, David, for a lot of our customers have really been struggling with having these mobile vessels because that again, if you move it, let's say it's a 200-liter mixer and you have 200 kilos inside of product or liquid and you move it and suddenly it says 180, then you have a problem. And we have had customers experiencing that. And this is typically because operators, either they forget to put on transportation brackets or locking the load system or the weighing system before they move it, or alternatively, it hasn't been done correctly. Because of the sensitivity of the strain gauge technology, it's just super critical that before you move it, that you really protect the system. So we see this thing where they move it too fast or before they have protected the system, and then suddenly they get a deviation on the weight. And you probably know this also, David, but this is of course creating huge issues because again, you have to stop the production because you have to figure out what do we do. Now I had 200 kgs in my mobile vessel. Now I have 180 kg. Where did the 20 kg go? What is the right weight right now? Is that 180 or is it 200? What is actually the weight of what I have? So it triggers a whole deviation management process, which is super expensive for the customers, both in time, resources. And of course, then you have the production stop, the delay. And even in a worst case scenario, you have to discard the product because if you can't do any kind of corrective actions to bring the quality back in and reestablish what the weight actually is and what the status of your product is, then you have to discard it. So you basically have to put it into the sewer, right? We have had customers that told us stories about how they had to empty vessels into the sewer because that there was a deviation in the weighing result. So this thing about that, the fact that we have this increased adoption of single-use technology within bioprocessing requires much more mobility in the production side, especially for tanks, vessels, mixers, bag holders. And this mobility requirement triggers then new requirements for the weighing system. And this is where our technology comes into play because our technology, because it's contactless, is just much more suitable for those type of mobile applications.
So besides the mobile applications, are there any other unique challenges for single-use system, especially when it comes to weighing?
It comes back again to what the application is such, because where you can say also now mobile application is one scenario, but you can also, if you just take a normal fixed tank and you have a big agitator or a big mixer inside, then the whole tank will move when you start a big agitator, especially if you have to do it, if it's a powerful one, the whole tank will move. So this basically moves the weight from side to side on the tank. I'm exaggerating a little bit. If you imagine it's the same like with a glass of water and you take a spoon, you stir it really powerful. You also have the weight going up to one side. So there you also see the weight shifting back and forth depending on where the water goes inside the tank. So this is the same here. So what you would have to do is if you can't manage that overload situation, you would have to increase the capacity of the weighing system. So that means you have a tank with 2,000 liters, which would be 2-ton capacity in the weighing system. Then if you're saying, okay, well, maybe sometimes actually all of the load is on one side. Then if it's a 4-legged tank, then all the weight to 2-ton would be on 2 load cells instead of 4. So that means that the capacity has to be 1 ton per load cell and you have 4 load cells. So you have double the capacity of the weighing system than what you actually need. So this is what we typically see with the strain gauge is they have to over-dimension the weighing system in order to make sure it doesn't get out of calibration or it doesn't get one of these deviations. You don't need that with our system because we can tolerate this. As long as it's just a momentarily overweight situation, we can manage that scenario. We can manage that event and we go back to a calibrated state right after. So that means that a little bit black and white, but if you have the 2-ton weighing system, we would have a capacity of 2 ton for the weighing system where again, in another scenario, you would have to at least over-dimension it to 3 or 4 ton. And again, accuracy for weighing system has to do with the weighing range. So the bigger the weighing system, the less accuracy. That's the drawback of having to over-dimension your load cells or your weighing system. And also there's a cost element, of course, too. If you have to buy a weighing system which has twice the capacity of what you need, of course, you're going to pay more for it as well. So there's also a cost dimension to this. So you can say every time there is not a stable environment, every time there's something that affects the weighing system. That could be, again, mixers. It can be any type of external force on the tank. It can be the mobile thing where if you run it over a cord or run it into a wall, or like every time you have an external force that actually affects the load system or the weighing system, that's where our technology comes into play.
And so what I understood, please correct me if I'm wrong, but with the traditional strain gauge system, you would have to overdimension the system so that it works, right? Whereas with your technology, you can use much smaller system or correctly dimension for the application.
Correct. It has to do with this robustness of handling an overload or a shock event. So this is where we can manage that. Of course, not on a continuous basis, but momentarily we can handle that situation without going out of calibration due to the contactless capacitive technology, where again, on a traditional strain gauge load cell, there you would basically break the load cell, or at least you would bring it out of calibration because you strain it too much, so it can't go back into its normal condition. So it can't go back to the before state. So that's why it would have to be recalibrated. Yeah, and then of course, we have a lot of other differences, but the key thing that comes to our technology is this contactless feature that allows it for, again, it could also be inside a sideway effect, or it can be, if you have a vacuum inside the tank and you release that vacuum, the whole tank might jump a little bit. Of course, I'm exaggerating. You don't have big tanks that jump. It can, and again, in a split second, it will just do a small jump. So that will also create a force and a load, an overload situation on the weighing system. So you have all these different scenarios where you can momentarily have an overload or a side load event. And there our technology has some benefits.
And what are the drawbacks of the contactless system versus to a traditional strain gauge system?
If you use it in controlled environments, it's basically just different technology. We have the same accuracy, we have the same, or of course it depends. I'm also painting a little bit black and white. There's of course multiple ways of doing strain gauge technologies. So it's not just that everyone is doing the same. We compare to the best in the market within strain gauge on accuracy, on all the other features. I would say the one thing that also characterizes our contactless system is it's purely digital, where again, a strain gauge is analog by nature. Like you start out with an analog signal, and then you might convert it with using an AD converter, but it's not digital from the start, where ours is digital from the start. And there's two benefits to that, David. There's both the fact that you can basically change everything in the system because it's a digital signal. So that means you can change cables, you can change everything you want without having to calibrate the load cell. For a strain gauge load cell, actually the cable will be part of the measuring chain. So if you change the cable, if you make the cable shorter, that will change the signal of the load cell. That means you have to recalibrate your whole system. So sometimes you actually see at customers where they have, let's say they have a long cable of 15 meters. They have to actually rolled up and attached next to the tank because they can't shorten the cable. We don't have that because it's a digital signal. So we don't care about how long the cable is. Also, again, we don't get into any interference on the signal. So it's a more pure signal. And then lastly, it also allows us actually to do measurement on the individual load cell. So where, again, traditional system, they measure the weight on the entire system, we can do it on each individual load cell. So that also allows you actually to find an overload event on a single load cell. So again, back to the mixer or agitator example, you have 4 legs on a tank. In our system, we were able to detect an overload just on one of the load cells. That's because we get the individual signal from all 4 legs and from all 4 load cells. So that's the benefit of having a digital system. And maybe the drawback, if we have to find one, it's difficult to do. Our founder, Eilersen, who founded the company 50 years ago, he spent a lot of time perfecting this technology, and it was not easy. So this requires, from a technical perspective, it was difficult to, you could say, develop this capacitive weighing principle. I'm sure that there will be a lot of stories if you talk to some of the people in the company with a long history. They will tell you that it was not that easy just to create this and develop this weighing system. We have had a lot of trials and errors, but we have 50 years of experience now. So now we have it. And there's a lot of small tricks and tips on how you do that, which we have learned over time, right?
What was the inspiration to develop this technology 50 years ago when single-use biotech was not around?
Well, actually, it's a fun story. The Eilersen family had a furniture company that did sofas. Niels, his brother, was in charge of the sofa company or the furniture company. And he had a problem where when he got wood in to make the sofas, he had to weigh them because he had to find out what the humidity was in the wood because they had to have a certain level of humidity in order to make it bend. So, you bend the wood in order to make a sofa. So in order to know how dry should it be or what should the humidity be in the wood in order to make it best for the sofa, then he needed to weigh it. And his scales kept breaking. And then he asked his brother, who had his studies on our technical university here in Denmark, had been centered around capacitive technology. So he said, why don't I use my knowledge about capacitive technology to do a capacitive scale? So no one had ever done a capacitive scale before. So Niels Eilersen, our founder, he started and said, maybe I can do a capacitive scale. And then he started in his basement trying to see if he could build a capacitive scale. It was because he came from a different area of expertise and then was asked by his brother saying, can you make a scale for me that doesn't break all the time? This is because, of course, they probably just dropped all the wood on the scale so that you create all these overload situations all the time because you dropped big piles of wood on the scale and, of course, it broke almost instantly. So that was the starting point, was basically he had to help his brother. And he built the first capacitive scale for measuring wood on sofas. So that was our starting point. So that was a long time ago. I'm sure also our technology has improved quite a bit since then. That was the starting point. So we have sold over the last 50 years, we have sold to many industries, many applications, but found out over time that there was a sweet spot when it came to especially pharmaceutical and bioprocessing. Because again, the combination of very, very high accuracy requirements, a very, very high cost of deviations, very, very regulated environment. And those features is just playing very well into our technology.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story. I mean, I love it. You come from furniture and now you're in biopharma. Amazing.
Yeah. So it took 50 years. So there's been a lot of Denmark, a lot of water under the bridge.
That wraps up part 1 of our fascinating discussion about load cell technology with Anders Tvegaard. Join us in part 2, where we will explore digital signal processing and the game-changing Eilersen waterless calibration system. Are you wondering how to develop and scale bioprocesses with peace of mind? Schedule your free assessment to propel your success using the link in the show note. I'm looking forward to seeing you on the call. All right, smart scientists. That's all for today on the Smart Biotech Scientist podcast. Thank you for tuning in and joining us on your journey to bioprocess mastery. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. By doing so, we can empower more scientists like you. For additional bioprocessing tips, visit us at smartbiotechscientist.com. Stay tuned for more inspiring biotech insights in our next episode. Until then, let's continue to smarten up biotech.